as the Sudan, Upper and Lower, Northern and Southern Sudan. The Sudan was Nubia, or Nubia was the Sudan. They are the same. What has been stated was that as Egypt had a heyday, and as the Egyptian Empire was one that was great, so was the Nubian Empire one that almost did not exist, except there are diggings presently going on in Nubia at a place called Ta-Seti, T-A-S-E-T-I, Ta-Seti. And at Ta-Seti, they're finding all kinds of things. They're finding that the reason why Egypt, in probability, started off with such glamour and with such dignity and with such structures was because it was spoon-fed by the Nubian Empire. Now, they have never taught this kind of thing in rational schools, in North Central schools, or in schools where history has been told of what's called the Near Eastern continent. They are being challenged in this by a Caucasian by the name of Bruce Williams, who is a lecturing, guesting, and touring professor at the University of Chicago. It is his finds and digs at Tassate in Nubia that are leading to a lot of changes, and most of his digs are still being cataloged in either the lower floors of the museum or in the research areas of his department. They are still openly not pervading and showing all of the things that they've already found. What they have found, again, is an incense burner, one of copper, one of gold. They have found jewelry and pottery. They have found a wheel. And of course, we know when the wheel supposedly was invented. They have found things of stone that are carved. They have found regality, royalty, thrones. They found ships that could go to sea, and pictures of ships that could go to sea with triple-headed people on them, meaning by this, triple-crowned people, which meant that they ruled both lower and upper areas of these places, and that they had royalty, they had a class system, they had schools and libraries, the whole thing. And this would only mean, since Nubia has never been guessed to be anything but a black area, the dark-skinned people carrying melanin, place of habitat, then it only shows even more that the history of Egypt and the history of Africa can go back and back and back in time. And much like that Newsweek article is saying, the reason why they can make these kind of assertions now, and people shake their heads and say, how can they dare, is because the scholars have already unearthed many things that they are not talking about in general. Where it could be commonplace by now, they are still subversively hiding most of this information. And the only reason I can see is because this is about a black person, black people in a black land. Whether you call it Negroid or colored, whether you say they're African, or whether you say that they were simply the ancient Negritos, this has to be the place where these people had great cities and had great impacts. I'm going to pass to you at this time also another class outline. In fact, Rhonda, can I get you to kind of come to side over here? And we've got two of them pass out, if you don't mind. One on Nubia, and then we'll be going over something on the chronology of Egyptian histories. After that, those will be the other pass outs for this evening. This is the one on Nubia. And then after that, this is the one. Okay, the first one you get will be, it's based on their Nubia, the oldest monarchy. Some will be in white, some will be in pink. Don't worry about it, they're all the same sheets. If there are any left over, we will put them on the table again where the books are in support of tonight's class. State Nubia, the oldest monarchy. And you might want to take a couple of minutes just to run through it. But in the general, it is what I have stated, that they're finding places at Tassati, and some of the things they're finding, and some of the reasons that they're saying now that this name means that this is a very old continent. And of course, this is information that you can see that you almost make your own history book based on modern findings and not on what has been generally told in our schools. way to the two coordinators for your Black History class, in case you can't get me, is Rhonda, who is just passing out some material to you, and Karen, who is in the back. In fact, you're about to take. You're leaving? Karen? Okay, well, thank you very much for the support and standing in. And if you wish to have questions or you have questions about your payments or about other things, you would contact either of those two young ladies and they can tell you how you can do so again for your Thursday classes. Okay, let's move now to our second sheet, which is 2 pages, and that is the one on the chronology of Egyptian dynasties, the Black World History course, chronology of Egyptian dynasties. It starts off with 3800, or it should start off with 3800 to 2700 BC. I think it might have 32 on this. Is that 32 or 38? 38. Okay, some have 32. All right. They put it at 32 to make sure that they were safe. I'd say put it at 38 and you know you're still safe. Actually, you can put it back about 42 and you wouldn't be too far wrong. But this is what they call being super safe. It states only that the Egyptian dynasty started off at about this time. But it started off with a battle that was fought between a man by the name of Scorpion, it's like the Scorpion that stings, and a man by the name of Menes. Scorpion and Menes. Scorpion represented Nubia. He represented as a general in the Nubian army that fought a battle with one of the breakaway provinces, a group of people who chose to expand from Nubia and then were joined with other people from Nubia, creating what was called the First Egyptian Dynasty. That dynasty, that Egyptian history, starts off with a man by the name of Menes. His full name was Menes Narmer. Menes Narmer. Narmer, believe it or not, means, or meant, whichever, hippopotamus hunter, or one who hunts. A Narmer was one who hunted hippopotami. So actually you could say Menes Narmer was a great hippopotamus hunter, so much so that Narmer was given him as a name. And Menes more or less means great or great one or strong one, something along this line. Menes Narmer was the first ruler of Egypt. Scorpion was a general already in the Nubian army, and this day they fought a battle. Now understand, this battle wasn't fought, although they had many men in arms. This was not fought by great armies of people on horseback or great armies of people on giraffes or gibbons or whatever you would. This was fought by 100 men from each side, even though there were thousands in the army. The battles at that time were not fought by masses of men in Africa. They were fought with masses of men watching while the leaders and a crack elite possibly would fight. So you had like 200 men taking place. And then once that had been decided, it got down to Scorpion and Menes and about 3 of their elite guards. It was Menes who beat Scorpion in this battle. And he could have chosen to kill him. He did not. He spared his life, and in the movies, of course, once you spare the life, supposedly this man is disgraced. Not like in this instance. And what he did do was to not only spare his life, but ask then that since they had proven that they were capable in at least the combat to hold their own, and since they were asking for a chance to continue their provincial work away from the mother country, or away from the mother land, in this case Nubia, that they be supported in this, and because of this, they would then support Nubia in her undertakings. To give a pretty good credence that this is exactly what happened, we must understand that there were 2 gods at this particular time. There was a god that was the ancient god of all Africa, which we talked about last week, which was Ra. And then there was a new god that the Egyptians had given almost to the same rank as Ra, that was called Amun. And so then you had one of the first gods of Egypt being Amun-Ra, which showed a direct linkage with the ancient Nubian civilization and now the modern Egyptian civilization. And they combined and had one god out of two, Amun-Ra. When we also look at the start of this dynastic period, and dynastic only means that these were all people who had shared, like dynasty on the radio, shared this basic bloodline at the beginning. And as long as the reigning monarch had bloodlines in this reign, that dynasty continued. When they no longer produced a male heir and could no longer spread their blood, then that dynasty ended and somebody else's dynasty started. So that's what is meant by a dynasty. Yes. It is during this period of time that many of the pyramids are said to have been started and finally completed. Many of what they call the ziggurats. That is Saqqurats, the ziggurats. And one of the most famous was a place called Abydos, which was in Egypt, where they built a couple of step pyramids, if you would. Also, when we look at this dynasty under Mene-Narmer and under the breakaway from the Egyptians, we find again the father of Zoser being born in the second dynasty, roughly around 3100 BC, even though on the sheet it is 29. And it is under this dynasty that two great men flourished. And I do want to mention this because sometimes you overlook. His name is Casimoi, and Imhotep. Casimoi begins to bring in a regal system to Egypt and begins to talk in terms of Upper and Lower Egypt being one. Not only have they now broken away from Nubian, but the Nile River flows backwards. And the interesting thing about the land elevation of Egypt is that the way it's situated, the upper areas where you had your big to-dos, where you had your big, if you would, buildings and so, and then the lower flatlands going down toward the Mediterranean, going down toward the sea, is where you had your markets and people living on like in the suburbs, the edges of the city. So it was from a height downward. And Upper Egypt, the height in the areas where you had your royalty, down toward the coastal lines where you had your suburbs, if you would. Casimoi set up a system of barter and a system of exchange with the lower Egyptians and the upper Egyptians, and even carried on trade and commerce with the Nubian, and as we shall see with other civilizations that were in Africa, in its lower western borders. Imhotep, or some call it Imhotep, whichever way it is, I-M-H-O-T-E-P, Imhotep.
How do you spell tax?
Yes, that's even more. Let's see how we check again. There's a certain little trick starting with K here. K, I'll put it on the board, K-H-A-S-E-K-H-E-M-U-Y. K-H-A-S-E K-H-E-M-U-Y. K-H-A-S-E-K-H-E-M-U-Y. Imhotep, I-M-H-O-T-E-P, or Imhotep. Now, it is stated in history now that Imhotep was, again, a person who was doing brain surgery, a person who was doing open heart surgery. Of course, Daniel L. Williams must wait. A person who was engaged in vaccinations, a person who used penicillin, mold, and fungi, a person who was consulted for even a form of semi-hypnosis, ability to put a person into a comatose state at will by mind pressure, acupressure on some of the lobes of the brain, and by the use of other herbs and drugs that the Egyptians knew of. Now, all of this was done in the court of Casimoi and done through Imhotep considered a philosopher and genius of our time. What is very interesting about all of that is that it is later Hippocrates, some 1,300 years, the Grecian physician, who is stated to be, and I quote, the father of medicine. And here, 1,300 years before Hippocrates was ever born, you had Imhotep doing things Hippocrates never did. And yet he never claimed to be the father of medicine. He stated that he learned it from the priest. The priest of Memphis, the priest of Men's, and so on like this, and that these had been hand-me-downs for generations within this area where we live. So it is almost, again, hypocritical in the sense of Hippocrates making a statement. And of course, most of the medicine men of today who are called medical doctors take what they even call the Hippocratic oath. There's a synthesis they use, however, that is called the caduceus. And you explain some medical doctor, unless he's also possibly an advanced mason at least over 28 degrees, to explain to you what that caduceus means, even though they use it as supposedly an allopathic symbol of medical technology. They cannot, because it is a metaphysical symbol. It's a Cushite symbol. It is a symbol that was used in ancient Egypt. And they cannot do so because there's nothing to do with the modern interpretation. When we again go forth from there, I guess I'm going to try and bring out just highlights of things that should be possibly remembered by you. We find under the dynasty of Huni, now, unless I otherwise stated, I am claiming, and you are studying black history, which means that these pharaohs, unless otherwise stated, are all black, or, using the proper verbiage, Negroid. And whatever mixtures come in, we will state when those mixtures come in. Right now, you have nothing but what we call Negrito black, or people carrying melanin dynasties. Under Huni, or Hunai, if you would, there is a son born called Rahotep. Rahotep, R-A-H-O-T-E-P. Not Imhotep now, but Rahotep. And probably between the 27th to the 26th dynasties, or again, or not dynasties, but those years, 2000 BC, this was probably the only pharaoh there of note. And Rahotep got his note because he went outside the borders and began to also do exploration in other areas and to try and bring into the Egyptian rulership extra territory, again going around hundreds of miles in all directions. During the period of time under what is called the Fourth Dynasty, roughly about 2680, 2680 BC, you had the Rhomboidal pyramid being built. And you had many of what we call the step pyramid rhomboidals. Rhomboidal pyramid, rhomboid in the sense, it's like two flat planes, one put up on top of the other. So the rhomboidal pyramids look like what we would call the ziggurats, or something like this. Then there were areas of excavation around that place. One of the first rhomboidal pyramids was said to be Senneferu. Senneferu. S-E-N-E-F-E-R-U. Senneferu. Now, that's not Senneferu. Senneferu that you see. There's no Khufu, no Khafre, no Menkaure. It is Senneferu. And he was the father of Khufu. Khufu later becomes known as Cheops, and it was pronounced Cheops by the Greeks who could not pronounce Khufu. And this is why the term saying it's Greek to me was always used, because most of the words that they heard, inasmuch as they were very uneducated, guttural people, they could not pronounce, and they began to make tones and intoneness of their own, which became a language that later was copied. Had nothing to do with the way the sounds were when the people were stating the names of these things, but simply Grecian interpretation. As we again look in this area of pyramid buildings, we find that the big three pyramids, which are found near Cairo, are formed from the names of these pharaohs that lived during these dynasties. You have what is called Menkaure pyramid. You have what is called as Cheops pyramid. You have what is called the unclassified pyramid. In actuality, they were said to have been built by Khufu or for And Sennacherib is where, Khafre, Kafir, is generally what is referred to as the unclassified pyramid of the big three found at the site that's so famous there in Egypt near Cairo. In the 6th dynasty, you have Una's pyramid. You might want to write that in because it's not on your sheet. Una's pyramid. And then Teti I's pyramid in about the 6th dynasty. Una's is UNA, and Teti I is TETI 1. TETI 1. What they were more known for is, again, the rapidity of trying to duplicate some of the older pyramids and having them built within a 10-year period of time during their reign. We moved then through, not too much happens in Egypt other than it expands, it begins to take in more trade, it begins to let in people from West Africa and from the Mid-East come into their lower levels, and that's about it. Our probably next highlight in time should be the 11th dynasty, about 134 BC. And you have then Mentuhotep I, and later on his son Mentuhotep II, M-E-N-T-O-H-O-T-E-P, Mentuhotep I and II. Mentuhotep I and Mentuhotep II also begin to ornately add figures and sketchings to some of the great pyramids in their internal chambers. Then you have the person known as Sesostris, or Sesostris, whichever, and he has a son, so you have Sesostris I and Sesostris II. He comes in, or they come in, about the 12th dynasty, and there you might want to pencil in S-E-S-O-S-T-R-I-S, S-E-S-O-S-T-R-I-S, Sesostris I and II, ancient Egyptian pharaohs. They also help to pave the streets, if you would, that in the areas that were arid, and to, again, resurface, if you would, some of the homes that began to break up during that dynasty, to glamorize the city, if you would. We skip through what is called the Hyksos period, and it's called the Hyksos period mainly because it is at this time that a race of people not looking like the Egyptian people or their Nubian cousins or brothers, if you would, came into being. And there was some race mixing in the lower areas of Egypt with these so-called Hyksos people, and that should be spelled H-Y-K-S-O-S. Hyksos or Hyksos, H-Y-K-S-O-S. These Hyksos did not take the throne of Egypt, nor did they get formally into its cabinetry, or definitely not into its priestcraft. They simply were people who did mingle with some of the Egyptians living near the coastal areas, and therefore became Egyptians by amalgamation, and any sons and daughters of Egyptians by bloodline. So you have an infusion there into Egypt, but not a domination or an attack by the Hyksos. We go even further now, and we'll move to what I like to refer to as the 18th dynasty. And this starts what is called the heyday of Egypt. This is a height now of the Egyptian history as we are beginning to learn. We start off with a person by the name of Thutmose I, that is T-H-U-T-M-O-S-E, Thutmose the First, or Thutmose I. Thutmose was a benevolent king who also wanted to expand Egypt in influence and in commerce. And he began to do as Rahotep had done, and Una to a limited degree, to go out thousands of miles or hundreds of miles for at least 2 or 3 months out of the year to see if they can add territory and keep influence for Egypt. Thutmose I also served or had in his cabinet maybe I should even phrase it that way because they didn't have priests in their cabinets per se. Just as Menes and Cassimoy had Imhotep, these people had a person by the name of Shabaka. Some call it Shabaka. Shabaka or Shabaka. S-H-A-B-A-K-E. Shabaka was a priest and a learned man travels with the Egyptian army, and that he had read with some of the scribes of ancient Medes and out of Nubian, and came up with what he called a code for living with a belief in a creator. They were known then later as the negative confessions. It is Shabbat at this dynasty, we're talking now around 1557, who wrote what is called the 32 negative confessions. The 32 negative confessions. They became the centering post and the cohesive for what was referred to later on by Budge and Matthews, and so as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's during this century that these Shabbatas articles were put. Now, why do I point that out? Because we will later see, if you take the metaphysical course, and even if you don't, you'll hear some references at time to time about these lost books. There was nothing lost about the books, but what they did there was to actually take many of these writings, in fact 12 of them, from the original 32 negative confessions, and they became what was known as the Ten Commandments. Now, I state that because even though we know to this, into Mount Sinai, of course, and we find that Moses, later on precursing Jesus' coming, is given this through God, the commandments, you will find that if you will read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and there are copies of it at the library or at the museum where you're going, both by Budge and Matthews, they will find that they read almost exactly alike. Well, the difference is definitely there. It's easy to see in correspondence, like the Ten Commandments. The only trouble is there are then 22 more. And they were known as the negative confessions of Shabbat. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is anything but about death or about dead people. It is really their book of life, because the Egyptians, part and parcel, you cannot even study Egyptology without understanding both through their commerce, both through their teachings, both through their way of life. They believed in reincarnation completely. They believed in past lives, and they believed that everything they were doing then was a culmination of things they had done before, and that the gods that they served and that the bloodlines and family lines were all again reincarnated. So you must understand that in understanding Egyptian history and their whole way of being, from the chairs and beds that they slept on, as we'll see, to their religion, is definitely, and the way that they did things, was a fervent and complete belief in reincarnation. And it was that it was considered that the soul, once departed from the body at what we call death, which they call transition, would have to be judged by many of the Egyptian lower gods. They had high gods, low gods, middle gods, and one creator, Ra, or Amun-Ra, if you will. And that Thoth, T-O-T-H, or some refer to it as T-H-O-T-H, I've seen it spelled both ways, was this god of judgment that ruled the underworld, your Amentet, A-M-E-N-T-I, and that once the soul had departed his ka, which is the spirit or soul, that's his body, they were then, before they could go to the netherworld or to the lower regions or to Amentet, they had to be judged by Thoth and his minions. And one of the things that they did, they had what later on became known in the Christian Bible as cherubim and cherubim. They had these judges, or these lesser little elementals, who would then take the soul and weigh it on the scales, which we now call the scales of justice, but the scale, and later on the Greeks called it the scales of Minerva. But these were simply called the scales of Ka, which were read by Thoth. And if the soul had only to balance against the weight of a feather, in other words, if there was so much on this soul's mind that he or she had done wrong and they were really worried, and their soul weighed the weight of a feather, they were judged unclean enough to go to the new world and were possibly doomed to relive another life as judges were taught. So all of this was believed in and taught through the negative confessions, or a way of life to preserve life, which were called the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The first female ruler of Egypt also comes into being during these highlight dynasty. Under again, approximately about 1489, you see on your sheet there a name Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut. H-A-T-S-E-P-S-U-T. Hatshepsut was a female. Thutmose I was her father. And Hatshepsut means she who keeps shut. my mind, and you might want to make the same judgments, or you might want to substitute whatever you would. But Hatshepsut sounds like something like maybe Kepsut, Kepshut, along the line, but that was her name, Hatshepsut. She also is stated by many in history now who denigrate her as being a lesbian. This is not true at all, as I can understand through historical records. The reason why they say this is simply for one reason: she had a beard. But you must understand something now. None of the Egyptians up through the 26th dynasty had beards. They couldn't even grow beards. So when you see pictures of the Pharaoh, like you see on the cover there, Tutankhamun and of Ramesses over there, and as you will see in National Geographic, which we're going to spend a little time with there, some of the diggings that they did at Abu Simbel when they moved from Thebes to Tel Amarna. These bearded pharaohs are not beards that are grown. Strike that from your mind. They were tie-ons. Every put them on Halloween fall spaces. And they all had the same type of tie-on. It was simply a band that fit almost like elastic around it, and they would adjust it, put it on the chin, and they would trim it to their own body mass type. And they wore them. The Egyptians were a clean-shaven person. Many of them could not even grow thick beards. Those beards, and if you look very closely at the stelas, which are statues of recognition, and if you look at some of the frescoes and pictographs and prints that come from the tombs and things, you'll see the direct line there. It even shows up on the picture there of Tutankhamun and upon Ramesses. They were not beards. The beards didn't come into the later dynasties, the Ptolemies, where you had the beards. They were simply hang on. But somewhere in their history, there was this reverence, obviously, among some of these pharaohs and rulers for a beard meaning wisdom, or in some way or another making a person seem more aged, and it was age they respected the wisdom of understanding. Because when they had big decisions to make, when they wanted to really get respect